September 3, 1945. Naval Air Station Alameda, California. The metallic clang of mess hall trays echoed through the converted warehouse as Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto stood in line, his eyes fixed on the dull gray slop being ladled onto plates ahead of him. The smell was institutional, vaguely meaty, utterly without character. Around him, captured Japanese soldiers muttered in quiet satisfaction, their assumptions about American military inferiority seemingly confirmed with every unappetizing plop of food onto metal trays. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Takeshi couldn't have known in that moment was that he was observing only half the story. Beyond the chain-link fence separating prisoner processing from active duty areas, a completely different culinary world existed, one that would shatter every belief he held about American discipline, military culture, and the relationship between a nation and its warriors. The revelation would come not through propaganda or coercion, but through the simple act of witnessing how America fed those it valued most. The journey to this moment had begun 4 months earlier on a rain-soaked morning in Okinawa. Takeshi had been a supply sergeant with the 32nd Army, responsible for distributing what little remained of Japanese rations as American forces closed in around Shuri Castle. By April 1945, the supplies he managed consisted primarily of moldy rice, occasional dried fish that had begun to rot in the tropical humidity, and a bitter tea made from leaves stripped from whatever plants grew near the caves where they sheltered. His unit had survived on approximately 400 grams of rice daily when supplies arrived at all, which became increasingly rare as American naval forces cut off resupply ships. The rice itself was often infested with weevils, and soldiers learned to cook it without looking too closely at what floated to the surface. Protein came from whatever could be caught or scavenged, small birds, insects, rats when fortunate. The men had joked grimly that they were becoming experts in unconventional cuisine, though the laughter always sounded hollow against the constant rumble of American artillery. Takeshi remembered the exact moment his world had collapsed. June 18, 1945. His commanding officer, Captain Hideaki Sato, had gathered the remaining 43 men of their unit in a limestone cave that shook with each nearby explosion. The captain's face was gaunt, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 30 pounds in 3 months. He spoke quietly, almost apologetically, explaining that further resistance served no purpose. The Americans had offered surrender terms. They would be treated according to international law. They would be fed. The word fed had hung in the cave's stale air like a prayer. Some men wept. Others sat in stunned silence. Takeshi had felt only numbness. He had been raised in Yokohama, the son of a textile merchant who had prospered in the 1920s before the military government redirected all resources toward imperial expansion. His childhood memories included abundant meals, his mother's cooking, the smell of grilled fish and miso soup that filled their home. By 1940, those memories had become fantasies. Rationing had turned meals into mathematical exercises in survival. The surrender process proved surreal. American Marines who entered their cave carried weapons but also water, medical supplies, and something Takeshi hadn't expected, a certain professional courtesy. They were searched, documented, given identification tags, and loaded onto trucks with an efficiency that suggested this was routine rather than exceptional. Nobody was beaten. Nobody was executed. The cognitive dissonance was profound for men who had been taught that surrender meant dishonor followed by death. The holding facility on Okinawa provided the first glimpse of American abundance, though in forms that initially seemed to confirm Japanese propaganda. The meals served in the temporary camps consisted of unfamiliar foods that many prisoners found unpalatable. Canned stew with mysterious meat floating in gelatinous gravy. White bread so soft it seemed undercooked. Coffee that tasted burnt and bitter. Powdered milk that left a chemical aftertaste. Vegetables boiled into colorless submission. Takeshi observed his fellow prisoners responding with a mixture of relief at being fed and contempt for American culinary barbarism. The food was plentiful, certainly, arriving on schedule 3 times daily. But it lacked the refinement that Japanese military culture associated with discipline and civilization. Where was the craftsmanship? The attention to presentation? The respect for ingredients that defined proper food culture? Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a former university instructor who had been conscripted into service, articulated what many felt during evening discussions in the barracks. The Americans have quantities but no quality, he observed to a group of listening prisoners. They approach food as fuel rather than as an expression of culture. This reveals their fundamental barbarism. They can produce but cannot create. They have abundance without understanding. These conversations reinforced existing beliefs. The men had been taught that American society was decadent, obsessed with material comfort at the expense of spiritual discipline. The institutional meals seemed to prove this thesis. The Americans fed their prisoners adequately, even generously by wartime standards, but without any apparent concern for the aesthetic or cultural dimensions of food. It was sustenance divorced from civilization. Takeshi wrote these observations in a carefully hidden journal, knowing that such writings could be confiscated but feeling compelled to document what he witnessed. The American military food is abundant but crude, he noted in tiny characters. They serve meat daily, more than we saw in months, yet it comes from cans and tastes of metal. Their bread is soft as clouds but has no character, no substance. They have conquered scarcity without achieving sophistication. The transport to California came aboard a converted Liberty ship that had been hastily modified to carry human cargo. The voyage took 18 days, during which the prisoners existed in the limbo between war and whatever came next. The meals served aboard ship continued the pattern, plentiful, nutritionally adequate, utterly without distinction. Canned everything. Powdered everything. Food that sustained life without celebrating it. Takeshi spent hours on deck when permitted, watching the vast Pacific pass beneath them. He thought about his family in Yokohama, hoping they had survived the firebombing he had heard about before communication ceased. He wondered what occupation would mean for Japan, whether the Americans would impose their crude efficiency on Japanese culture, whether the refinement he had known as a child would survive contact with this well-fed barbarism. The first sight of San Francisco Bay provided a shock of a different kind. The city sprawled across hills in a way that suggested unlimited resources and space. Buildings rose in clusters that seemed to compete for height. Ships crowded the harbor in numbers that exceeded anything Takeshi had seen, even in Tokyo Bay before the war. Cranes moved cargo with mechanical precision. Warehouses stretched along the waterfront in seemingly endless succession. But it was the smaller details that struck him most forcefully. Automobiles everywhere, moving freely without the military restrictions that had governed Japanese civilian transport since 1941. Workers on the docks eating lunch from metal boxes, food they brought from home or purchased from vendors who circulated freely. The vendors themselves, selling items that had disappeared from Japanese cities years ago. The casual abundance was almost offensive in its normality. Naval Air Station Alameda became Takeshi's new home in early September. The facility sprawled across hundreds of acres on the eastern shore of the bay, primarily dedicated to serving the naval aviation units that had helped win the Pacific War. The prisoner compound occupied a converted warehouse complex separated from the active base by fencing and guard towers, but close enough that prisoners could observe daily operations. The processing began immediately upon arrival. Medical examinations revealed the extent of malnutrition that had become normalized. Takeshi weighed 53 kilograms, down from his pre-war 72. His teeth showed signs of scurvy. His skin had the papery quality that came from protein deficiency. The American doctor, a Navy lieutenant commander named Richardson, examined him with clinical detachment while a translator conveyed his questions and instructions. "How long since you had fresh fruit?" Richardson asked through the translator. Takeshi calculated mentally. "More than a year, perhaps 15 months. The doctor made notes, then asked about meat consumption. "Maybe once a week in the final months," Takeshi replied, though the portions were small and the quality poor. More notes. "Dairy products?" "Never, except powdered milk in the field rations early in the war." The doctor's expression suggested he was documenting something significant, though his tone remained professionally neutral. The initial meals at Alameda continued what Takeshi now recognized as standard American military rations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mess hall served breakfast at 0600, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800, with the precision that characterized everything in American military operations. The food arrived on schedule, prepared in quantities that ensured everyone ate adequately, presented without ceremony or apparent concern for aesthetics. Breakfast typically consisted of scrambled eggs from powder, bacon or sausage links, toast with butter and jam, coffee, and sometimes oatmeal or cold cereal with milk. The portions were generous by Japanese standards, shocking by the standards of the past year. Takeshi forced himself to eat despite his stomach's protests, knowing that rebuilding strength required fuel even when the fuel lacked appeal. Lunch brought variations on American themes. Sandwiches made with processed meat and cheese. Soup from cans heated in massive pots. Occasional hot dishes like meatloaf or fried chicken that bore little resemblance to any cuisine Takeshi recognized. Side dishes of canned vegetables, coleslaw made with mayonnaise, potato salad, macaroni salad. White bread in unlimited quantities. Coffee always, that bitter American coffee that prisoners learned to drink because it was hot and caffeinated. Dinner represented the main meal, though the quality remained stubbornly institutional. Meat in various forms, pot roast, pork chops, hamburger patties, occasionally fish sticks that tasted primarily of breading and fryer oil. Starches, mashed potatoes from powder, rice that had been boiled into sticky submission, noodles in various configurations. Vegetables, canned green beans, canned corn, canned carrots, occasionally fresh lettuce with bottled dressing. Desserts, sheet cake, cookies, canned fruit, pudding from mix. The prisoners ate this food with mixed reactions. Relief at consistent availability. Gratitude for the sheer quantity. But also a persistent contempt for what they perceived as American culinary poverty. The food sustained them, certainly. It was rebuilding bodies wasted by malnutrition. Yet it seemed to confirm their assumptions about American materialism divorced from culture, abundance without refinement. Lieutenant Tanaka articulated this interpretation during evening discussions that had become informal lectures for groups of listening prisoners. "Observe what they feed us," he would say in his professor's voice. "Everything from cans or packages. Nothing fresh except occasional bread. They have industrialized food as they industrialize everything, removing the human element. This is why they won the war but will lose the peace. They can produce but cannot create meaning." These discussions took place in the barracks after evening meals, when prisoners gathered in small groups to process their experiences and maintain some connection to Japanese identity. Tanaka had emerged as an intellectual leader, partly from his education, partly from his ability to provide frameworks for understanding their bewildering circumstances. His interpretations offered comfort, a way to preserve dignity despite defeat. Takeshi participated in these discussions but found himself increasingly troubled by contradictions he observed. Yes, the prisoner food was industrial and uninspired. But the guards who served it ate the same meals without complaint. And the portions suggested resources so vast that quality became secondary to availability. A nation that could feed thousands of enemy prisoners 3 substantial meals daily possessed capacities that Japanese propaganda had never acknowledged. The prison compound itself suggested similar contradictions. The facilities were basic but adequate. Barracks with electric lights, running water, flush toilets, and heating systems for the approaching winter. Medical clinic staffed with doctors and equipped with medicines. Recreation yard with equipment for exercise and sports. Library with books in Japanese, maintained by the International Red Cross. Canteen where prisoners could purchase items with scrip earned from labor. Work assignments began within a week of arrival. Prisoners were organized into labor details supporting base operations, primarily maintenance and construction tasks that freed American personnel for other duties. The work was not particularly difficult, certainly nothing compared to combat conditions or the brutal labor some had expected as prisoners. 8 hours daily, 6 days weekly, with Sundays free for rest and recreation. Takeshi found himself assigned to grounds maintenance, a detail that kept the vast base presentable through constant mowing, trimming, and cleanup. The work crew consisted of 15 Japanese prisoners supervised by a single American sailor, a signalman second class named Roberts, who treated them with casual indifference rather than hostility. Roberts demonstrated what needed to be done, then largely left them to complete tasks while he read magazines or wrote letters in the shade. The grounds maintenance assignment provided Takeshi's first real glimpse of the active base beyond the prisoner compound. The work took them throughout non-restricted areas, maintaining lawns and gardens around administrative buildings, enlisted barracks, and recreational facilities. It was during these daily rounds that Takeshi began noticing details that didn't fit the narrative he had accepted. The base operated with a scale and efficiency that became more impressive the more he observed. Hundreds of aircraft moving constantly, landing and taking off with precision timing. Ground crews swarming over planes between flights, performing maintenance with practiced coordination. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, supply vehicles moving in choreographed patterns that suggested elaborate planning and execution. The infrastructure required to support this level of activity dwarfed anything Takeshi had witnessed in Japanese military operations. But it was the people who most challenged his assumptions. American sailors and officers moving with purposeful energy rather than the grim determination he had seen in Japanese forces during the war's final months. They walked with straight backs and healthy faces. Their uniforms fit properly on well-fed bodies. They laughed and joked during breaks, their morale apparently unaffected by years of warfare. They seemed confident in ways that went beyond military discipline, as if victory had been inevitable rather than hard-won. The contrast with Japanese military culture was stark. Takeshi had been taught that American forces lacked the spiritual discipline for sustained warfare, that their comfort-seeking nature would collapse under pressure. Yet these men had crossed the Pacific, fought from island to island, and emerged apparently unbroken by the experience. Their casual confidence suggested reserves of strength that propaganda had denied existed. 2 weeks into his work assignment, Takeshi experienced the observation that would ultimately reshape his entire understanding. The grounds crew was maintaining hedges near the officers' club, a building that served as the social center for base leadership. It was approaching noon, and the crew could hear sounds from within the club, conversation, laughter, and something else. Something that made Takeshi pause mid-clip and inhale deeply. The smell drifting from the club's kitchen was nothing like the institutional odors of the prisoner mess hall. This was rich, complex, layered with scents that triggered memories of his childhood before the war. Grilled meat, but not the gray processed variety served to prisoners. Real meat, cooking over proper heat. Onions caramelizing. Butter or oil at temperatures that developed flavor rather than merely heating food. Herbs that had been missing from his diet so long he had almost forgotten their existence. Roberts noticed Takeshi's distraction and grinned. "That's the O Club," he explained in simple English that Takeshi's limited vocabulary could follow. "Officers eat there. Good food. Better than what we get in the regular mess." His tone was matter-of-fact, neither resentful nor particularly interested, as if this hierarchy of dining was simply natural order. The revelation hit Takeshi like a physical blow. The institutional food in the prisoner mess hall wasn't representative of American cuisine. It was military rations, the baseline feeding system. But American officers ate differently. They had access to better food, presumably prepared with care and skill rather than industrial efficiency. The crude meals that had seemed to confirm American barbarism were simply the bottom tier of a more complex system. That evening, Takeshi mentioned this observation during the usual discussion group. Lieutenant Tanaka dismissed it immediately. "Of course officers eat better," he said with a wave of his hand. "This is true in all militaries. The privileged always ensure their own comfort while the masses receive whatever remains. This actually confirms American class divisions that their democracy claims to eliminate." But something about the explanation didn't satisfy Takeshi. The smell from that kitchen had suggested more than simple privilege. It had suggested knowledge, skill, attention to culinary craft that contradicted everything they had been told about American food culture. And Robert's casual acceptance implied that such hierarchies were considered normal and unremarkable rather than sources of resentment or class conflict. Over the following days, Takeshi paid closer attention to the different dining facilities visible from their work areas. The regular enlisted mess hall, where sailors lined up for meals that appeared similar in quality and presentation to what prisoners received. The chief's mess, which seemed slightly elevated but still basically institutional. And the officers' club, which clearly operated on a different level entirely. He observed officers entering the club at mealtimes, often in groups, sometimes with what appeared to be civilian guests. They moved with the relaxed purpose of people anticipating pleasant experiences rather than obligatory refueling. Through windows, he occasionally glimpsed tables set with real tablecloths, place settings that suggested actual dining rather than institutional feeding. Waiters in white jackets moved between tables with practiced professionalism. The cognitive dissonance grew stronger. If America was the culturally impoverished society that Japanese propaganda had described, why would its military leadership maintain such obviously refined dining facilities? If Americans were merely materialistic barbarians, why invest resources in culinary sophistication when simple calories would suffice? The contradictions multiplied without satisfactory resolution. 3 weeks into his assignment, opportunity arrived in unexpected form. Roberts approached the work crew with a special task. The base commander was hosting a reception at the officers' club for visiting dignitaries, some kind of inspection tour from Washington. The club's regular maintenance staff was overwhelmed with preparation. The grounds crew would assist with setting up the exterior areas, arranging chairs and tables for outdoor cocktails before the formal dinner inside. Takeshi found himself carrying furniture under Robert's direction, setting up what was clearly meant to be an elegant gathering space. White tablecloths appeared. Flower arrangements in colors that seemed almost aggressive after years of military drabness. Crystal glassware that caught afternoon sunlight and threw rainbow patterns across the lawn. Silver serving pieces that spoke of resources dedicated to aesthetic presentation rather than mere function. But it was when the kitchen staff began bringing food outside for the cocktail reception that Takeshi's understanding truly shattered. The items that appeared bore no resemblance to military rations. Small plates appeared carrying delicate arrangements that looked like art as much as food. Shrimp arranged in spirals around cocktail sauce. Sliced beef so thin and perfectly pink it could only have been roasted with precision and skill. Vegetables cut into elegant shapes, raw but obviously the highest quality. Cheese varieties and arrangements that suggested knowledge of what belonged together. The smells overwhelmed him. Fresh herbs that he recognized from his mother's pre-war kitchen, basil, cilantro, mint. Citrus from fresh lemons squeezed over seafood. Garlic roasted until sweet rather than harsh. Pastries emerging from ovens with the butter and sugar combination that defined proper baking. Each scent triggered memories of what food could be when treated as culture rather than fuel. Takeshi worked in a daze, moving chairs and tables while stealing glances at the culinary production happening around him. The kitchen staff, both military cooks and what appeared to be civilian caterers, worked with the focused intensity of craftspeople rather than industrial processors. They tasted as they cooked, adjusted seasonings, arranged presentations with obvious care for visual appeal. This was cooking in the sense he remembered from childhood, elevated by skill and attention rather than reduced to efficient calorie delivery. The officers began arriving as afternoon shifted toward evening. They came in dress uniforms that fit perfectly on healthy frames. Their bearing suggested confidence earned rather than forced. They moved between conversation clusters with social ease, drinks in hand, sampling food with the casual appreciation of people accustomed to quality. Some brought civilian dates or spouses, women in elegant dresses that suggested wartime privation had not extended to all aspects of American society. What struck Takeshi most forcefully was how normal this appeared to everyone involved. The officers weren't behaving as if this reception represented unusual luxury. They accepted the quality food, the elegant presentation, the social refinement as simply how these events occurred. For them, this was standard rather than exceptional. American military leadership apparently expected and received dining experiences that exceeded anything Takeshi had witnessed in Japanese officer culture. The final shock came near evening's end, when Roberts told the grounds crew they could take leftover food before cleanup. Takeshi approached the tables hesitantly, unsure if this offer was genuine or some kind of test. But Roberts just laughed and made eating motions. "Go ahead," he said. "Otherwise it just gets thrown away. Can't serve it again. Health regulations." The casual statement revealed another layer of abundance. Food of this quality would be discarded rather than recycled because regulations prevented reuse. Resources existed in such excess that waste became systematized, built into standard procedures. Takeshi selected a small plate of items that had been barely touched: beef sliced thin and still pink, a piece of cheese he couldn't identify, some kind of pastry with fruit. The first bite of beef made him close his eyes involuntarily. The flavor was nothing like canned rations or institutional meat service. This had been seasoned thoughtfully, cooked with precision, served at a temperature that enhanced rather than merely heated. The cheese was complex, aged, nothing like the processed American cheese served in the prisoner mess. The pastry combined butter, fruit, and subtle spices in ways that demonstrated real pastry craft. He ate slowly, trying to memorize these flavors and what they represented. This was American food culture at its highest level, and it bore no resemblance to the crude rations that had seemed to confirm Japanese propaganda. The Americans possessed culinary sophistication that they simply didn't bother applying to military mess halls. They could create but chose not to, which implied resources so vast that quality became optional rather than necessary. That night, Takeshi lay in his bunk unable to sleep, mind racing with implications he couldn't fully process. Everything he had believed about American culture demanded reconsideration. The industrial rations in the prisoner mess weren't representative but baseline. American society clearly contained multiple tiers of food culture, from efficient institutional feeding to refined dining that rivaled anything he had known in pre-war Japan. More troubling were the questions this raised about Japanese propaganda. If Americans weren't culturally barbaric about food, what else had been misrepresented? If their military leadership expected and received refined dining experiences, what did that suggest about resource depth? If officers could maintain this level of civilization while fighting a global war, what kind of societal strength did that demonstrate? Lieutenant Tanaka tried to dismiss these concerns during the next evening's discussion. "So they feed their officers well," he argued. "This is standard corruption, privileged classes taking care of themselves. It reveals nothing about true American culture or military capacity. If anything, it demonstrates the class divisions they hypocritically deny while claiming democratic equality." But Takeshi couldn't accept this explanation anymore. The reception he had witnessed wasn't corrupt luxury extracted from suffering masses. It was standard operating procedure, expected and normal. The officers hadn't been celebrating victory or special occasion. They had simply been hosting a routine inspection visit. This level of dining was apparently what American military leadership considered normal and appropriate. The following weeks brought a new obsession. Takeshi began watching the officers' club with focused attention, trying to understand what happened within those walls. He observed delivery trucks arriving daily with what appeared to be fresh ingredients. Civilian workers entering and leaving, some wearing chef's whites beneath street clothes. The kitchen exhaust vents releasing smells that varied by day, Italian seasonings one evening, Asian spices another, what seemed like French cooking techniques applied to American ingredients. He noticed officers and their guests departing after meals with the satisfied expressions of people who had enjoyed genuine dining experiences. Some lingered over coffee and dessert, visible through windows, their posture relaxed and social rather than rushed. Others emerged carrying small packages, apparently taking leftover desserts or pastries home. The club clearly operated as a real restaurant rather than institutional feeding facility. The cognitive dissonance became physically painful. Every assumption Takeshi had held about American society demanded revision. The crude rations that had seemed to prove cultural barbarism were revealed as simply the baseline tier of a complex system. American civilization clearly included sophisticated food culture. It simply wasn't being applied to military mess halls or prisoner feeding, not because of inability but because of choice. The implications extended beyond food. If Americans possessed this capacity but chose to apply it selectively, that demonstrated strategic thinking rather than limitation. They could feed everyone institutional rations efficiently while reserving refined dining for appropriate contexts. This suggested organizational sophistication that Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on shared suffering and equality of privation, had failed to develop. More troubling was what this revealed about resource depth. America could fight a global war while maintaining civilian quality dining for its officer corps. It could host elegant receptions in military facilities as standard procedure rather than rare celebration. It could throw away quality food because health regulations prevented reuse. The casual abundance suggested reserves that Japanese propaganda had never acknowledged. Takeshi found himself questioning other aspects of what he had been taught. If propaganda had lied about American food culture, what else had been misrepresented? If Americans weren't culturally barbaric, what had motivated Japanese military leadership to initiate war against such capacity? If the stories about American weakness and democratic chaos were false, what was the true nature of the society that had defeated Japan? These questions haunted him through October as base routines became familiar and his body continued recovering from months of malnutrition. He gained weight steadily on the institutional rations, his frame filling out toward pre-war normal. His energy returned. His thinking became clearer as proper nutrition supported cognitive function. The physical recovery paralleled growing intellectual doubts about everything he had believed. The answer to his questions would come, though not in any form he could have anticipated. It would emerge not from officers or their refined dining, but from an entirely different category of American military personnel, those who flew the missions that had helped win the Pacific War. The revelation would arrive through the simple observation of what America fed the men who had taken the greatest risks, and what that revealed about how this society valued its warriors. The revelation came on a crisp November morning when Roberts assigned the grounds crew to a new area. The flight line hangars needed landscaping attention, areas that had been neglected during the final push of the war. Takeshi found himself trimming hedges near Hangar 7, home to a fighter squadron that had recently returned from operations near Japan itself. The pilots arrived mid-morning, walking from their ready room toward the hangar in flight suits that marked them as a different category of military personnel entirely. They moved with loose confidence, laughing and joking in ways that suggested stress had been left behind with their missions. What caught Takeshi's attention immediately was where they were heading. Not toward the general mess hall, but toward a smaller building adjacent to the hangar that he had assumed was storage. Smoke began rising from behind the building within minutes. Not the greasy smoke of institutional kitchens, but the clean wood smoke he remembered from proper cooking. The smell that followed made him stop working entirely. Grilled meat, but cooked over real fire with seasonings that carried on the breeze. Onions and peppers being charred. Fresh bread warming. Coffee brewing in quantities that suggested quality rather than bulk production. Roberts noticed Takeshi's distraction and followed his gaze. "That's the squadron galley," he explained. "Pilots don't eat in the regular mess. They've got their own setup. Better food, better atmosphere. Keeps morale up after missions." His tone suggested this was common knowledge, unremarkable fact rather than special privilege. The statement opened a door in Takeshi's understanding. American military culture apparently recognized that different roles deserved different treatment. Pilots who risked death daily received dining experiences that exceeded standard rations. This wasn't corruption or class privilege, but systematic recognition of value and stress. The military fed people according to what it asked of them. Over the following days, Takeshi manufactured reasons to work near Hangar 7 during meal times. The squadron galley operated on a different schedule than regular mess halls, serving breakfast after morning briefings, lunch between training flights, dinner after debriefings. Each meal produced smells and sounds that suggested real cooking rather than institutional reheating. He observed pilots entering and leaving with expressions that confirmed quality dining. They lingered over meals rather than rushing through. They carried coffee cups outside, standing in small groups discussing flights and missions while savoring drinks that were clearly superior to standard military issue. Some emerged with plates still in hand, finishing meals while walking, the food apparently good enough to consume completely. The breakthrough came when a young pilot named Lieutenant Anderson noticed Takeshi watching and approached with surprising friendliness. "You guys did good work on the landscaping," he said through gestures and simple words. "Makes the place look less like a war zone." His smile was genuine, without the patronizing quality Takeshi had sometimes detected in other American personnel. Anderson pulled a pack of cigarettes from his flight suit and offered one to Takeshi. American cigarettes, not the harsh Japanese brands. They smoked together in companionable silence for a moment before Anderson spoke again. "You hungry? We've got extras from lunch. Cook always makes too much. Come on, I'll get you something." Takeshi followed hesitantly, aware that Roberts had wandered off and wouldn't notice his brief absence. The squadron galley occupied a converted storage building that had been transformed into something resembling a small restaurant. Tables with actual tablecloths. Chairs instead of benches. Windows with curtains. The space felt human rather than institutional, designed for comfort and community rather than efficient feeding. The kitchen area visible through a service window revealed the source of those remarkable smells. A cook in navy whites worked at a proper stove, not industrial steam tables. Fresh ingredients lined counters, vegetables in bins, meat on cutting boards, herbs in pots by the window. Pots simmered with stocks. Pans held sauces reducing to concentrate flavors. This was real cooking equipment used by someone who understood culinary craft. Anderson spoke to the cook, a chief petty officer named Martinez who looked more like a restaurant chef than military personnel. Martinez nodded and began assembling a plate with generous portions. Grilled chicken breast seasoned with herbs Takeshi couldn't identify. Roasted vegetables that had been caramelized rather than boiled into submission. Rice cooked properly, each grain separate and fluffy. Fresh bread still warm from the oven. A side salad with real lettuce and tomatoes. Takeshi accepted the plate with both hands, bowing slightly from ingrained habit. Anderson gestured to a table and sat across from him, watching with obvious curiosity as Takeshi took the first bite. The chicken was perfect. Moist, seasoned throughout, grilled to develop flavor rather than merely heated. The vegetables retained texture while gaining sweetness from proper roasting. The rice reminded him of his mother's cooking, each grain distinct and properly prepared. He ate slowly, trying to process what this meal represented. This wasn't officer privilege or special occasion. This was standard pilot dining, what American military culture provided to aviators as routine. The quality exceeded anything served in the prisoner mess by orders of magnitude. It rivaled pre-war civilian dining in Japan. And according to Anderson, this happened every day, 3 times daily, for every squadron on the base. Martinez emerged from the kitchen wiping his hands on a towel. He looked at Takeshi's nearly empty plate and smiled with professional satisfaction. "You like it? Good. Pilots need real food, not mess hall garbage. Can't have them going up tired or hungry." His English was too fast for Takeshi to follow completely, but Anderson translated the essence. The conversation that followed, conducted through Anderson's patient translation and generous interpretation, revealed the philosophy behind squadron galleys. The Navy recognized that pilots faced extraordinary stress and physical demands. Flying combat missions required peak cognitive function, quick reflexes, sustained concentration under life-threatening conditions. Proper nutrition wasn't luxury but operational necessity. Each squadron had dedicated cooks, usually chiefs with culinary training beyond basic military food service. They received budgets that allowed purchasing fresh ingredients rather than relying solely on warehouse stocks. They planned menus with attention to nutrition, variety, and morale. The galleys operated as small restaurants, creating community and comfort in addition to providing sustenance. Martinez explained his background with obvious pride. He had worked in restaurants in San Diego before the war, learning from chefs who had trained in professional kitchens. The Navy had recognized his skills and assigned him to flight operations rather than general mess duty. He cooked for 40 pilots, preparing meals that acknowledged their value and supported their missions. The work gave him more satisfaction than any restaurant job had provided. The resource investment astounded Takeshi. Each squadron on this base had similar arrangements. Dozens of dedicated cooks preparing quality meals for thousands of aviators. Fresh ingredients purchased and delivered daily. Equipment that enabled real cooking rather than industrial reheating. Time allocated to proper preparation rather than efficient mass production. The systematic approach to feeding pilots revealed priorities that Japanese military culture had never developed. Anderson offered more context that deepened Takeshi's understanding. Squadron galleys weren't unique to this base or even to Navy aviation. The Army Air Forces maintained similar systems for bomber and fighter crews. Even submarine crews, those who faced prolonged deployments in confined conditions, received dedicated cooks and quality ingredients. American military culture systematically recognized that personnel facing greatest danger deserved best food. The philosophy contradicted everything Takeshi had been taught about military discipline and shared sacrifice. Japanese military culture emphasized the quality of suffering, officers eating little better than enlisted men, everyone enduring privation together as expression of warrior spirit. The Americans instead calibrated treatment to role and risk, providing abundance where it would sustain performance and morale. More troubling was what this revealed about resource depth. America could afford dedicated cooks and fresh ingredients for every flight squadron while simultaneously maintaining institutional feeding for general personnel and even feeding enemy prisoners adequately. The multiple tiers of food service operated simultaneously without apparent strain on logistics or supply chains. Resources existed in such excess that quality could be distributed according to strategic value rather than rationed equally. Over the following weeks, Takeshi found opportunities to observe other squadron galleys. Fighter squadrons, bomber crews, patrol aircraft personnel, each had similar arrangements with variations reflecting unit culture and cook creativity. Some emphasized steaks and traditional American fare. Others incorporated regional cuisines or experimental dishes. All maintained standards far exceeding institutional mess halls. He noticed social patterns that reinforced the galley's importance. Pilots ate together, building unit cohesion through shared meals. They lingered over coffee, discussing missions and tactics while processing stress. New pilots were welcomed through galley traditions, initiated into squadron culture through food and fellowship. The dining experience served military purposes beyond simple nutrition. The cooks took obvious pride in their work, competing informally to provide best meals and most creative menus. Martinez mentioned that pilots sometimes requested specific dishes, and he accommodated when possible, treating their preferences seriously rather than dismissing them as inappropriate in military context. The relationship between cook and pilot was collaborative, both working toward mission success through their respective roles. Takeshi observed Thanksgiving preparations that revealed another dimension of galley culture. Martinez began planning days in advance, ordering special ingredients and coordinating with other squadron cooks. Turkey, obviously, but also regional specialties that reflected America's diverse culinary traditions. Sweet potatoes prepared multiple ways. Cranberry sauce from actual berries. Pumpkin pie with real spices. The feast planning rivaled anything Takeshi had witnessed in pre-war civilian life. The Thanksgiving meal itself, which he observed from his work detail outside, demonstrated systematic celebration that contradicted notions of American cultural poverty. Each squadron hosted elaborate dinners with decorations and ceremony. Pilots dressed in clean flight suits rather than working uniforms. Tables were set with care suggesting special occasion. The meals lasted hours rather than the rushed feeding of institutional mess halls. What struck Takeshi most forcefully was that this celebration occurred simultaneously with ongoing military operations. Some pilots ate early before night missions. Others arrived late after completing patrols. The war continued, but American military culture made space for cultural traditions and human connection. They celebrated abundance even while fighting, demonstrating confidence that resources existed for both war-making and civilization-maintaining. Lieutenant Tanaka's evening discussions could no longer provide satisfactory explanations. When Takeshi described squadron galley culture, Tanaka tried dismissing it as propaganda or exaggeration. But other prisoners had made similar observations. Too many men had witnessed the same patterns. American military culture systematically invested in quality of life for personnel facing greatest risks, and that investment reflected resource depth that Japanese propaganda had never acknowledged. The psychological impact multiplied across prisoner population. Men who had believed in American weakness now confronted daily evidence of overwhelming capacity. The institutional rations that had seemed to prove barbarism were revealed as baseline tier in complex system. American society could provide abundance at multiple levels simultaneously, from adequate institutional feeding to restaurant-quality dining, all while fighting global war. Takeshi's transformation accelerated through December as his work assignments continued near flight operations. He observed aircraft maintenance that revealed similar patterns of resource investment. Spare parts available without apparent shortage. Tools maintained in excellent condition. Ground crews working with equipment that enabled efficiency rather than making do with inadequate supplies. Everything suggested logistics systems that functioned smoothly despite supporting operations across the Pacific. The contrast with Japanese military operations became unbearable to contemplate. He remembered mechanics cannibalizing damaged aircraft for parts. Tools shared among multiple units because supplies had been exhausted. Maintenance delayed because necessary materials simply didn't exist. The resource scarcity that had been normalized in Japanese forces was revealed as consequence of systemic failure rather than inevitable wartime condition. Christmas brought another revelation. Squadron galleys prepared elaborate celebrations that incorporated traditions from diverse backgrounds. Martinez cooked both traditional American dishes and Mexican specialties reflecting his heritage. Other cooks contributed recipes from Italian, Polish, Irish, and various regional American traditions. The diversity itself demonstrated cultural confidence, multiple traditions coexisting without apparent conflict. Local civilian volunteers arrived on Christmas Day, women from nearby communities who brought homemade desserts and gifts for pilots. The interaction between military and civilian society suggested integration rather than the separation Takeshi had observed in Japan. American communities apparently supported their military through personal engagement rather than simply through taxation and conscription. The gifts themselves revealed systematic generosity directed at military personnel. Hand-knitted scarves and socks. Homemade cookies and candies. Letters from school children thanking pilots for their service. The voluntary nature of these contributions demonstrated civilian buy-in to military operations, society supporting warriors through choice rather than compulsion. Takeshi received permission to help serve Christmas dinner in one squadron galley, working alongside Martinez in the kitchen. The experience provided intimate glimpse of galley operation and pilot culture. Martinez explained his cooking philosophy while preparing multiple dishes simultaneously. "Food is respect," he said through Anderson's translation. "These guys go up and risk everything. Least I can do is feed them right. Make them feel valued. Give them something good to remember if things go bad up there." The statement captured something fundamental about American military culture that Takeshi was only beginning to understand. The systematic investment in pilot dining wasn't inefficiency or indulgence. It was strategic recognition that human beings performed better when treated as valued rather than expendable. Pilots who ate well, who felt cared for, who knew their service was appreciated, flew with confidence that enhanced performance. Japanese military culture had emphasized spirit over material comfort, arguing that physical privation built warrior character. Officers and enlisted men shared minimal rations to demonstrate equality of sacrifice. The approach had seemed noble, evidence of superior discipline and spiritual strength. Now it appeared as systematic failure to understand human psychology and operational efficiency. The Americans fed their pilots restaurant-quality meals because doing so enhanced military effectiveness. They invested resources in comfort and morale because returns exceeded costs. They treated warriors as valuable assets requiring maintenance rather than as expendable resources to be used until exhausted. The philosophy was practical rather than spiritual, but results suggested its superiority. Takeshi thought about Japanese pilots he had known, men who flew missions on inadequate rations, who faced death on empty stomachs, who were told that sacrifice itself was victory. The American approach seemed almost insulting by comparison, reducing warrior spirit to matters of nutrition and comfort. Yet American pilots had dominated Pacific skies. Their well-fed bodies and supported morale had proven more effective than Japanese spiritual purity and willing sacrifice. February brought confirmation of repatriation schedules. Prisoners would begin returning to Japan within months, processed through staging areas and then transported aboard ships being converted from military to humanitarian use. The news created mixed emotions. Relief at eventual return home. Anxiety about what home had become. Uncertainty about how to integrate experiences that challenged every previous belief. Martinez, learning of impending repatriation, invited Takeshi for a final meal in the squadron galley. The dinner reflected the cook's full capabilities: perfectly grilled steak, roasted vegetables with herbs from his window garden, fresh bread, salad with multiple components, dessert that combined American and Mexican traditions. They ate while Anderson translated conversation that ranged across cooking philosophy, cultural differences, and hopes for peace. Takeshi Yamamoto returned to Japan in May 1946, carrying with him more than just memories of American squadron galleys. He had tasted systematic respect, witnessed how a nation honored those who served it, and experienced a military culture so confident in its values that it invested resources in human dignity even during total war. The meals shared with pilots had taught him that true strength came not from enforced suffering, but from recognizing that well-fed warriors fought better, that morale mattered as much as firepower, and that a society willing to care for its defenders possessed depths of civilization that propaganda had never acknowledged. His transformation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners, became the foundation for post-war reconciliation. They returned home not as broken men, but as witnesses to a different way of organizing society, one that balanced efficiency with humanity, discipline with care, and military necessity with cultural values. The squadron galleys had fed more than bodies. They had nourished understanding that would help rebuild a shattered world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.